August 1943. The bomber stream crossing the Alps that morning stretched across the sky in the disciplined formation that 8th Air Force doctrine prescribed, tight, mutually supporting each aircraft position to contribute its guns to the defensive envelope that massed bomber formations were supposed to generate around themselves as compensation for the absence of fighter escort at the ranges the deep penetration missions required. From the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190, Hauptmann Hans Philipp, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated fighter pilots, a man with more than 200 aerial victories accumulated across 3 years of combat on every front Germany was fighting, studied the formation with the professional assessment of someone who had made this particular calculation many times before. The B-17s were vulnerable. He knew where they were vulnerable. He knew the angles of approach that minimized exposure to the defensive guns, the attack geometries that the bomber's physical configuration created in its defensive coverage, the brief windows that a fast, disciplined attack could exploit before the formation's gunners could bring their weapons to bear effectively. He had built his survival and his extraordinary kill record on exactly this knowledge. What Philipp did not know, what no Luftwaffe pilot attacking American bomber formations in the summer and autumn of 1943 had yet fully incorporated into his tactical calculation, was that the gunners in those B-17s were not simply spraying lead into the sky and hoping. They were operating a gunnery system whose theoretical foundation had been developed by physicists and engineers at American universities and research institutions, tested in wind tunnels and ballistic laboratories, and translated into training programs that industrialized the production of aerial gunners with the same systematic thoroughness that American industry applied to the production of the aircraft those gunners flew in. The system did not require its operators to be gifted marksmen. It required them to understand a specific set of calculations about relative motion and lead angle and bullet travel time that the training had reduced to a set of procedures applicable under combat conditions by men who had been mechanics and farmers and students 6 months earlier. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe and hit the bell. These are the stories that history almost forgot, and we find them every single week. The problem that American aerial gunnery training addressed was one of the most demanding in applied physics that military technology had encountered in the Second World War. A bomber gunner attempting to hit a fighter aircraft was not attempting to hit a stationary target at a known range. He was attempting to hit a target moving at 300 to 400 miles per hour at a closing or crossing angle that changed continuously throughout the engagement, from a platform that was itself moving at a different speed and heading, through air that introduced its own variables of wind and density into the bullet's trajectory, with ammunition whose ballistic characteristics added additional calculations to an already complex equation. The naive approach, pointing the gun at the fighter and firing, produced results that looked like gunnery, but were not, because the bullet's travel time from the gun to the fighter's position was long enough that the fighter had moved entirely out of the bullet's path before the bullet arrived. The correct approach required the gunner to fire not at where the fighter was, but at where the fighter would be when the bullet arrived. A calculation that required knowing the fighter's speed, its angular rate of movement across the gunner's field of view, the range to the target, and the ballistic characteristics of the ammunition, and combining all of these into a lead angle that placed the bullet stream in the fighter's future path rather than its current position. Solving this problem under combat conditions, in a freezing, oxygen-depleted, vibrating, noise-saturated environment, while an attacking fighter was closing at closing speeds of 500 miles per hour or more, and the entire engagement lasted perhaps 3 seconds from first acquisition to last shot, was beyond the unaided capacity of any but the most exceptionally gifted natural marksman. The American solution was not to find exceptionally gifted natural marksmen, though they were welcomed when found. It was to develop a training system that made the calculation manageable for ordinary men by reducing it to a set of visual cues and physical procedures that could be learned, practiced, and executed under stress by anyone with normal visual acuity, adequate physical coordination, and the ability to follow a training protocol. The foundation of this system was the concept of the ring sight, a gunsight design that translated the complex lead angle calculation into a visual problem that the gunner could solve geometrically rather than mathematically. The standard K-13 computing gunsight, introduced to American bomber gunners through 1943 and 1944, took this concept further by incorporating a gyroscopic mechanism that automatically calculated and displayed the correct lead angle based on the target's angular rate of movement across the sight picture. The gunner who used the K-13 correctly did not need to calculate the lead angle himself. He needed to track the target smoothly and consistently within the sight's reticle, maintaining the tracking rate that the gyroscope translated into a continuously updated lead angle display, and fire when the sight picture indicated he was in the correct geometric relationship to the target's future position. The physics were done by the instrument. The gunner's job was to track and to pull the trigger at the right moment. The training system that taught American gunners to use this equipment was itself an expression of American industrial and organizational depth. The Central Gunnery School established at Tyndall Field in Florida, and a network of gunnery training facilities that fed it with students and received its graduates as trained aerial gunners, processed tens of thousands of men through a curriculum that had been developed with the systematic rigor of an educational program designed by people who understood both the physics of the problem and the psychology of teaching it to men under the time pressure that the war's demands imposed. The training used camera guns, devices that recorded what the gun sight was aimed at during practice engagements against towed target aircraft, to provide gunners with immediate, objective feedback on the accuracy of their tracking and their timing, eliminating the subjective assessment of performance that verbal instruction alone produced and replacing it with documented evidence that both the instructor and the student could analyze together. This feedback loop, repeated across dozens of practice engagements before a gunner was cleared for combat, produced a level of consistent, documented competency that subjective training methods could not reliably achieve. The specific innovation that earned the description of gunners hitting targets while apparently blindfolded, and that Luftwaffe pilots encountered with a frequency and a consistency that their tactical training had not prepared them for, was the trained American gunner's ability to engage targets that were not directly visible within his gun sight's field of view. By tracking the angular motion of an attacking fighter through the peripheral cues that the sight system provided and maintaining a firing solution that was accurate despite the brevity of the engagement window and the extreme difficulty of the tracking problem. German fighter pilots who had studied the B-17's defensive gun positions and developed attack geometries designed to exploit the blind spots in the formation's defensive envelope found, with a regularity that contributed to the mounting losses the Luftwaffe was sustaining in the bomber intercept mission, that the blind spots were less blind than the geometry suggested, that American gunners were engaging their aircraft with accuracy at angles and ranges that the theoretical analysis of the defensive coverage had identified as relatively safe. The explanation was not that the theoretical analysis was wrong. It was that American gunnery training had produced gunners whose situational awareness and tracking capability exceeded what the theoretical analysis had assumed, and whose use of the computing gun sight allowed them to maintain effective firing solutions in conditions that earlier, simpler gun sight designs would have made impractical. Hauptmann Philipp did not survive the autumn of 1943 to fully incorporate this understanding into a revised tactical approach. He was killed in October 1943 in an engagement with American fighters, not by a bomber gunner, but by the broader tactical revolution that the American air campaign was conducting against the Luftwaffe fighter arm through that decisive season. His death was one among hundreds of experienced Luftwaffe pilots lost in the battles of 1943 and 1944, each loss representing the irreplaceable accumulation of combat experience that the German training system could not reproduce at anything approaching the rate of attrition. The American gunnery training system, by contrast, was producing trained aerial gunners in quantities that the replacement pipeline kept continuously supplied. Men who arrived in theater with a documented, tested level of competency that the camera gun records and the range scores confirmed, and who brought to their first combat mission the specific procedures and the specific sight picture training that the system had developed, refined, and validated across hundreds of thousands of training hours. The oxygen mask that each American bomber gunner wore at altitude, that standard, unremarkable piece of equipment that kept a man functional in the thin air above 20 1,000 feet where the B-17 formations flew was in its ordinary way the same argument about American industrial abundance that every previous episode of this channel has traced across its specific domain. It was there because the system that produced it had never been broken, never been rationed into inadequacy, never been forced to substitute inferior alternatives for standard equipment because the standard equipment was no longer available. The gunner who wore it could think clearly at altitude, track accurately, and maintain the procedural discipline that the gunnery training had built into his performance because the oxygen that kept him capable of all of these things was always there, delivered by a supply system whose depth the war had not exposed to the kind of crisis that Japan and Germany were managing with increasing desperation in the war's middle and final years. By the time of the great air battles over Germany in the spring of 1944, the battles that the American air campaign's commanders called the Big Week Offensive and that the Luftwaffe's subsequent historians identified as the decisive turning point of the air war over Europe. The American bombing formations were equipped with the K-13 computing gunsight in increasing numbers, crewed by gunners who had passed through the training pipeline that the Central Gunnery School and its associated facilities had been refining since 1942, and operating the tactical procedures that the accumulated experience of 18 months of combat had validated and institutionalized. The Luftwaffe fighter arm that rose to meet them was operating at the edge of its replacement capacity, absorbing losses of experienced pilots that the training system could not make good at anything approaching the rate they were being incurred, and attempting to maintain the tactical proficiency of its intercept mission against a defensive gunnery capability that had improved substantially and continuously since the first unescorted bomber raids of 1942 had revealed both the bombers' vulnerability and the gunner's potential. The transformation that the American aerial gunnery system produced in the tactical calculus of the bomber intercept mission was not the elimination of the German fighter threat. The Luftwaffe remained dangerous throughout the air war, and American bomber losses, even with the computing gunsight and the trained gunners and the eventual long-range escort that the P-51 Mustang provided, were heavy enough to constitute a sustained test of the American military establishment's institutional courage and the replacement system's industrial depth. What the gunnery system produced was the progressive erosion of the tactical confidence that Luftwaffe intercept doctrine had been built upon. The confidence that a well-executed attack along a geometrically sound approach vector would deliver the attacker to a position of advantage against a defensively capable but ultimately manageable gunnery threat. The K-13 and the training that taught gunners to use it moved that confidence's foundation, engagement by engagement, toward a less stable equilibrium, one in which the calculated approach vector was less reliably safe than the calculation suggested, and in which the 3-second window of a high-speed intercept pass produced defensive fire of a quality and a volume that the tactical mathematics had underestimated. Freedom trains its defenders differently than fear trains its warriors. It builds the gun sight in a physics laboratory and tests it in a wind tunnel and teaches it in a school that processes tens of thousands of students and documents their performance with camera guns and range records and the institutional commitment to knowing whether the training is working rather than simply believing that it is. It does this because a democracy at war is a democracy that has decided the men it sends into the sky deserve the best preparation available, and because the best preparation available is what the freedom to invest in it, without the resource constraints that authoritarian systems impose on the priorities their industrial base must address, makes possible. The gunner who hit a German fighter at an angle that the fighter pilot had calculated was safe was not a gifted natural marksman performing feats beyond the reach of ordinary men. He was an ordinary man who had been trained by an extraordinary system, equipped with instruments designed by physicists who understood the problem, and supplied with the oxygen and the ammunition and the aircraft and the everything else that a civilization organized around productive freedom could afford to provide without asking whether the next supply would arrive. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe if you have not already. The men who flew and fought in those bomber formations deserve to be remembered with the precision they brought to the worst moments of their lives. We will keep finding their stories,